The Varkesh Empire didn't ask nicely when they wanted something. They took it. 14 star systems had already fallen to their might, each one conquered the same way, through the Dragon Arena. It was their sacred tradition, their way of proving dominance. Send your best warrior, they demanded. Let them face the Crimson W arms. When your champion falls, your world bows. When Earth refused to surrender, the Varkesh didn't hesitate. They wanted our finest warrior. They wanted someone who could represent humanity's strength, our will to fight, our determination to survive. The message came through every communication channel across the planet. Send us your champion or we'll reduce your cities to ash. Earth's response shocked everyone. They sent Daniel Hayes, a 17-year-old kid who could barely walk without assistance. A boy whose muscles were wasting away, whose body was betraying him more with each passing day. Muscular dystrophy, the doctors called it. A death sentence wrapped in a medical term. The Varkesh High Command watched the transport ship land on their arena world. They watched as Daniel was carried out on a hover stretcher because walking the distance would exhaust him. Their Supreme War Chancellor, a massive being named Thrak who stood nearly 4 meters tall, broadcast his rage across every human colony in space. You mock us with this broken child? His voice boomed through the speakers. You send us your weakest when we demanded your strongest. For this insult he will die screaming in the arena. And when the Crimson W armies tear him apart, when his blood soaks into our sacred sands, we will come for your world. Every city will burn. Every human will learn what happens when you disrespect the Varkesh Empire. The threats meant nothing to Daniel. He'd been dying since he was 12. Fear of death wasn't something that kept him up at night anymore. What did bother him was the waste of it all. Back on Earth, he'd die in a hospital bed, mourned by his parents and maybe a handful of friends who'd stuck around when things got bad. Here, at least, maybe his death could mean something bigger. The arena itself was enormous. Crimson sand stretched for nearly a kilometer in every direction, surrounded by towering walls filled with hundreds of thousands of alien spectators. They'd come from across the Empire to watch another species fall. To see their Crimson WYRMS, the Empire's ultimate predators, rip apart yet another challenger. It was entertainment. It was tradition. It was how the Varkesh proved their superiority over and over again. Daniel's handlers, 2 lower-ranking Varkesh soldiers who clearly drew the short straw for this assignment, helped him down from the hover stretcher. One of them actually looked away when Daniel's legs nearly buckled. There was something almost like pity in the alien's eyes. Almost. They walked him slowly across the sand toward the center of the arena. Every step was agony. Daniel's muscles screamed in protest, but he kept moving. Billions were watching this broadcast across human space and throughout the Varkesh Empire. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him carried like cargo to his death. The crowd's roar was deafening. They wanted blood. They always wanted blood. Daniel could see the holding gate at the far end of the arena, massive doors of reinforced metal that barely contained whatever was behind them. The Crimson WRMS. He'd seen the footage during the flight here. Creatures that combined the worst aspects of Earth's ancient dinosaurs with alien bioengineering that made them even more lethal. 20 meters long, covered in scales harder than steel, with teeth that could crush starship hulls. 12 species had sent their champions to this arena. 12 champions had died here. Warriors who'd trained their entire lives for combat, who stood over 2 meters tall and could bend metal with their bare hands. The WRMS had killed them all within minutes. And now it was Daniel's turn. A kid who got winded walking up a flight of stairs. The handlers left him at the center of the arena. They didn't say anything. What was there to say? Daniel watched them retreat to the safety barriers, watched the Varkesh officials in their viewing boxes preparing to give the signal. Watched the holding gate where he could hear the WRMS moving behind it, their claws scraping against metal, their growls vibrating through the ground. This was it. This was how humanity's story ended in the Varkesh Empire. With a sick kid standing alone in an arena, waiting to be torn apart by monsters. Except Daniel wasn't waiting to die. He was waiting to try something that would either be the stupidest decision in human history or the most brilliant. He'd spent every hour of the 3-week journey here studying. Not combat techniques. What use would those be? He studied the WRMS themselves. Their behavior patterns. Their genetic composition. The Varkesh had used Earth DNA as the foundation for these creatures, splicing in their own genetic material to create the perfect killing machines. But they'd made one critical mistake. They understood violence. They understood dominance and strength and conquest. What they didn't understand was the language that Daniel had spent his entire painful life learning. The language of creatures who were feared, who were misunderstood, who just needed someone to see past the surface. Daniel raised his trembling hand. His arm shook from the effort, but he kept it steady. Then he did something that confused every single being watching. He sat down, cross-legged in the sand, like he was settling in for a casual conversation. And he began to hum. A low, steady sound that rose and fell in specific patterns. Mathematical almost. Rhythmic. The kind of sound that vibrated at just the right frequency. The crowd's roar faded to confused murmurs. The Varkesh officials looked at each other, uncertain. War Chancellor Throck leaned forward in his viewing box, his 4 eyes narrowing. The holding gate opened. 3 crimson WRMs burst out, their roars shaking the arena walls. They charged across the sand, a wave of scales and teeth and claws heading straight for the small human figure sitting calmly in the center. Daniel kept humming, kept his hand raised, kept his eyes open even though every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to do anything but sit there waiting. The lead WRM was 30 meters away. 20. 10. Then it stopped. Its massive head tilted to the side, confusion evident even in its alien features. The humming sound Daniel made wasn't threatening. It wasn't prey fleeing or another predator challenging. It was something the creature's Earth-based genetics recognized at a deep, instinctual level. It was the sound of someone who understood. The largest WRM lowered its head slowly, cautiously. Its nostrils flared as it took in Daniel's scent. The boy didn't move. He kept humming that strange pattern, kept his hand extended in a gesture that somehow communicated calm instead of challenge. The other 2 WRMs circled behind, waiting to see what their leader would do. 20 billion beings across the galaxy held their breath. Then the massive creature did something it had never done before in the arena. It laid down. Right there in the crimson sand, its enormous body settling beside the frail human boy like a dog coming home to its owner. Daniel's hand touched the scales on its neck, and the WRM's eyes, reptilian and cold just moments before, seemed to soften. The arena exploded in chaos. Aliens in the crowd were screaming, some in anger, others in disbelief. The Varkesh officials were shouting into their communication devices, demanding explanations. War Chancellor Throck stood up so fast his ceremonial chair toppled backward. None of them understood what they were witnessing. But Daniel understood perfectly. He'd spent the last 5 years of his life trapped in a body that wouldn't cooperate, couldn't run or play or do any of the things normal teenagers did. So he'd spend his time differently. While other kids were out playing sports or hanging with friends, Daniel was watching nature documentaries, reading animal behavior studies, learning everything he could about how creatures communicated, how they thought, how they reacted to the world around them. The Varkesh had built their crimson WRMs using genetic material from Earth's dinosaurs. Specifically, from the theropod family, the same branch that eventually became modern birds. They'd taken that ancient DNA, twisted it, engineered it into something more deadly. But they'd kept the base instincts intact. The behavioral patterns. The responses that were hardwired into the creatures at a fundamental level. What the Varkesh saw were weapons. Daniel saw animals. For the first hour, the arena authorities did nothing. They assumed the WRMs were toying with their prey, that any moment now they'd strike. This was all just unusual behavior before the inevitable kill. So they waited. The crowd waited. The galaxy waited. Daniel kept working. He shifted the pitch of his humming slightly, and one of the other WRMs approached. This one was more aggressive, its body language tense. Daniel recognized the signs immediately. It was testing him, trying to figure out if he was prey or threat or something else entirely. He slowed his breathing, made himself smaller, turned his body slightly to the side. Non-threatening postures. The same kind of body language that worked with nervous dogs back on Earth. The WRM sniffed at him, its hot breath washing over Daniel's face. Then it too settled down beside him. By the second day, all 3 WRMs were responding to Daniel's signals. He'd figured out that different humming patterns triggered different responses. A low, steady hum meant calm and rest. A slightly higher pitch with a rhythmic pulse meant alert but not aggressive. A specific 3-note pattern meant come closer. Another pattern meant back away. The Varkesh tried to disrupt things. They cut off the water supply to the arena, thinking dehydration would make the WRMs irritable and attack. Daniel simply shared his own meager water ration with the creatures. They lapped it from his cupped hands like puppies. The officials starved the WRMs for an entire day, hoping hunger would override whatever strange influence the human had. Instead, Daniel shared his own food, not much, just protein bars and dried fruit, and the WRMs protected him even more fiercely after that. On the third day they tried introducing other warriors into the arena. A volunteer from one of the conquered species, a massive being covered in natural armor plating who thought he could succeed where others had failed. The moment he entered, all three WRMs stood up. Daniel made a subtle gesture with his hand, barely noticeable from the viewing stands. The WRMs positioned themselves between Daniel and the warrior, their growls low and threatening. The warrior retreated before they even moved toward him. That's when the Varkesh tried sonic weapons. High-frequency emitters designed to disorient and stun the WRMs from a safe distance. Daniel saw the weapons being positioned around the arena rim. He'd learned to read the WRMs body language by now, could tell they sensed something wrong. So he did something that seemed insane to everyone watching. He positioned himself directly between the WRMs and the weapons. When the emitters fired, Daniel took the full brunt of the sonic assault. It dropped him to his knees, blood trickling from his nose. But it gave the WRMs time to locate the source of the attack. They learned. They memorized the shape of those weapons, the smell of the Varkesh soldiers operating them. And they became even more protective of the small human who'd shielded them. War Chancellor Throck had seen enough. He descended to the arena floor himself, something that hadn't happened in over a century of trials. His 4-meter frame cast a long shadow over Daniel, who was still kneeling in the sand, exhausted from the sonic weapons effects. Two of the WRMs immediately moved to flank Daniel protectively. "What manner of sorcery is this?" Throck demanded, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "What witchcraft do you humans possess that allows you to control our sacred beasts?" Daniel looked up at the warrior who'd conquered 14 star systems. His nose was still bleeding. His arms were shaking from holding his weight. But his voice was steady when he spoke. "Not sorcery. Not witchcraft. Just paying attention." He gestured weakly at the WRMs. "Your scientists gave them Earth DNA. Ancient predator instincts. But they never bothered to learn how Earth predators actually think. They saw monsters to unleash. I saw animals that needed understanding." One of the WRMs growled at Throck's aggressive posture. The War Chancellor's hand moved instinctively to his ceremonial blade, then froze. The WRM's eyes tracked the movement, muscles tensing. For the first time in his decorated military career, Throck stepped backward. He was retreating from something. Not because it was stronger, but because it was protecting something it cared about. Daniel managed a weak smile through his exhaustion. "They're not weapons, Chancellor. They never were. They're just scared animals that were trained through pain to be violent. I showed them something different. I showed them gentleness. And that's all it took." The arena was silent now. No cheering. No roaring crowd. Just millions of beings across the galaxy watching as everything they thought they understood about strength and power got turned completely upside down by a dying human boy who could barely stand. Throck looked at Daniel, then at the WRMs, then back at Daniel. Finally, he said the words that would change everything. "Teach us how you did this." The Varkesh High Command emergency meeting lasted for 18 hours straight. They'd never faced anything like this before. Their entire system of control, 3 centuries of tradition, all of it built on the idea that the Crimson WRMs were unstoppable killing machines. Now a sick human teenager had turned them into protective companions in less than 4 days. If they killed Daniel now they'd look weak, afraid of what he represented. But if they let him go free they admitted defeat. That their sacred trial meant nothing. That humanity had beaten them without throwing a single punch. War Chancellor Throck proposed something radical. Something that made half the council members walk out in protest. He wanted Daniel to teach them. To share whatever knowledge allowed him to do the impossible. Daniel's conditions shocked everyone even more than Throck's proposal. He didn't ask for money. Didn't demand territory or resources. His first condition was simple and non-negotiable. Earth stays free. No invasion. No occupation. No revenge for the perceived insult of sending him instead of a real warrior. His second condition made the Varkesh scientists furious. He wanted full access to every bioweapon program in the Empire. Every genetic laboratory. Every classified file about how they'd created the WRMs and dozens of other creatures designed for conquest. The third condition was the strangest. Daniel demanded they bring him the dying. Warriors who'd been crippled in battle. Civilians with terminal diseases. Anyone in the Empire who was facing death and didn't know how to handle the fear that came with it. When the council demanded to know why, Daniel's explanation was brutally honest. "You want to understand how I tamed your dragons? Then you need to understand what made me able to do it. I've been dying since I was 12 years old. Every day I wake up weaker than the day before. Every day I lose a little more of myself. You spend your lives chasing strength and power. I spent mine learning to live with weakness. That's the difference. He paused, catching his breath. Even talking for this long exhausted him now. I made friends with those WYRMS because I understood them. They're scared. They're in pain. They've been hurt and trained through punishment to be violent. Nobody ever showed them kindness before. Nobody ever treated them like they were worth more than being weapons. I know what that feels like. To be seen as less than you are. To be defined by what's wrong with you instead of what's right. The council approved his terms. They didn't have much choice. The entire galaxy was watching now. Every species in the Empire, every conquered world, they'd all seen what happened in the arena. If the Varkesh refused to learn from this, they'd look like fools. Worse, they'd look like cowards. The program started small. Daniel worked with a dozen WRM handlers, all of them experienced warriors who'd lost something in service to the Empire. There was Drell, a decorated soldier who'd been paralyzed from the waist down when a WRM he was transporting broke containment. There was Krev, who'd lost 3 limbs to a training accident. And Mira, a handler who'd developed a degenerative nerve condition that left her hands trembling constantly. The other handlers mocked them at first. Called them the broken squad. The ones who couldn't cut it anymore. But Daniel saw something different. He saw people who understood loss. Who knew what it meant to have their bodies betray them. The first lesson wasn't about the WRMS at all. Daniel made them sit in a circle, made them share their stories. What happened to them. How they felt about it. The fear and anger and grief they carried. Most of them had never talked about it before. In Varkesh culture, weakness was something you buried deep and never acknowledged. That's your first problem right there, Daniel told them. You think acknowledging pain makes you weak. But pain doesn't make you weak. Pretending it doesn't exist does. Because then you can't learn from it. Can't grow past it. You just carry it around like dead weight. He had Drell wheel himself over to one of the smaller WRMs. The creature's eyes tracked the wheelchair, curious but not aggressive. Drell's hands were shaking. He'd been mauled by one of these things. Every instinct told him to keep his distance. Don't fight the fear, Daniel coached. Let the WRM see it. They can smell it anyway. But show them you're not a threat. Show them you're vulnerable. That's not weakness. That's honesty. Drell reached out slowly. The WRM moved its head closer, sniffing at his hand. Then it did something that made Drell's eyes go wide. It gently pressed its snout against his palm and just held it there. The same creature that had nearly killed him years ago was now seeking comfort from him. That's when Drell started crying. Big, heaving sobs that he couldn't control. And the WRM stayed right there, patient and calm like it understood. The Empire's medical staff started noticing changes in the program participants. Their pain levels decreased. Their mental health scores improved. Some of the degenerative conditions even seemed to slow their progression. At first, they thought it was just good data. Then they realized what was actually happening. The dying boy was teaching apex predators to be healers. And in the process he was healing the handlers too. Word spread through the Empire. More volunteers requested to join the program. Not all of them were handlers. Some were just soldiers dealing with trauma. Others were civilians who'd lost everything in the Empire's conquests and couldn't find a reason to keep going. They came expecting to learn about taming monsters. Instead, they learned about taming the monsters inside themselves. Daniel pushed himself harder than his doctors wanted. He knew time was running out. His body was failing faster now, the stress of the work accelerating the disease's progression. But he kept going. Every morning he'd work with the handlers. Every afternoon he'd document everything in detailed manuals. Training protocols. Behavioral charts. Everything he knew about the WYRMS and how to communicate with them. Late one night, Drell found him in the medical wing, still writing even though his hands could barely hold the stylus anymore. "Why are you doing this?" Drell asked. "You're killing yourself to teach us. You could go back to Earth. Spend your last days with your family in comfort." Daniel didn't look up from his work. "Back home I'm just a sick kid. Another tragedy. Something for people to feel sorry about. Here I'm building something that matters. A bridge between species. A new way of thinking about strength and power. When I die this continues. This grows. That's worth more than a comfortable death." He finally looked up at Drell and there was fire in those tired eyes. "You asked me once if I was scared to come here. Scared to face the WRMS. You want to know the truth? I was terrified. But not of dying. I've been dying for years. I was scared I'd die without meaning anything. Without making any kind of difference." Daniel gestured around at the facility, at the handlers working with WYRMS in the distance, at everything they'd built together. This right here? This means I mattered. This means my life counted for something bigger than just being a tragedy that happened to some family in Oregon. So no, I'm not going home. Not until every word is written down. Not until I know this survives me. Drell nodded slowly. He understood now. They all did. Daniel wasn't just teaching them about animals. He was teaching them that sometimes the greatest strength comes from accepting your weakness. That vulnerability isn't something to hide. It's something to share. Because that's how you connect. That's how you build bridges instead of walls. Daniel Hayes died on a Tuesday morning, 63 days after he first walked into the Dragon Arena. He went peacefully in his sleep, a crimson WRM named Memory curled protectively around his bed. The creature refused to move for 2 full days after, as if keeping watch over the boy who'd shown it kindness when everyone else showed it only fear. The news hit Earth like a shockwave. His parents, Robert and Jennifer, had known this was coming. They'd said their goodbyes through video calls, watched their son grow weaker with each transmission. But knowing didn't make it easier. Their boy had died light years from home, surrounded by aliens on a world they'd never see. What they didn't expect was what came next. War Chancellor Throck announced a state funeral. Not a quiet ceremony. A full imperial state funeral with all the honors reserved for the Empire's greatest heroes. The same honors they'd given to legendary warriors who'd conquered entire systems. They were giving those honors to a human teenager who could barely walk. Throck himself carried Daniel's ashes to the arena floor. The same arena where this all began. Thousands of Varkesh filled the stands, but this time there was no roaring crowd demanding blood. There was only silence. Respectful, heavy silence. The 3 WRMs, memory, courage, and understanding, the names Daniel had given them, performed something researchers had never seen before. They moved in synchronized patterns around the arena, their movements almost like a dance. A morning ritual. Scientists would spend years trying to figure out if Daniel had taught them this, or if they'd created it themselves as a way to say goodbye to the only being who'd ever treated them with gentleness. Then Throck did something that shattered 300 years of Varkesh tradition. He stood before the assembled masses and declared the trial by combat system abolished. Finished. No more conquered species forced to send champions. No more entertainment through death. It was over. His speech echoed across every world in the Empire. This human child showed us something we'd forgotten in our centuries of conquest. True strength isn't found in domination. It's found in understanding. He defeated the undefeatable not with weapons or combat skills, but with compassion. With wisdom. If humanity can produce such warriors even in their weakest form, then they deserve our respect, not our subjugation. The political implications were massive. Earth suddenly went from being next on the invasion list to being courted as an ally. The Varkesh proposed a partnership, human behavioral scientists and animal experts working alongside Varkesh genetic engineers and military strategists. Not to create better weapons. To understand the weapons they'd already created. To treat them better. To see them as living beings instead of tools. Daniel's training manuals became required reading across the Empire. Every handler, every bioweapon facility operator, every soldier who worked with engineered creatures had to study his methods. The changes were immediate and dramatic. Rebellion rates among conquered species dropped by 40% in the first year alone. Turns out when you stop ruling through fear and start trying to understand people, they're less likely to fight back. But the biggest changes happen with individuals, not politics. Drell, the paralyzed warrior Daniel had befriended, became head of the new Interspecies Understanding Division. His first major act was establishing the Daniel Hayes Fellowship. It brought together beings from across the galaxy who'd been dismissed as too weak, too broken, too damaged to contribute meaningfully to society. Former soldiers with PTSD. Civilians with disabilities. Anyone who'd been written off because they didn't fit the traditional definition of strength. The fellowship proved something revolutionary. Those who'd experienced weakness often had insights that the naturally strong never developed. They noticed things others missed. They approached problems from different angles. A former warrior named Krev, who'd lost his legs in combat, developed a new communication system that worked across 12 different species. He succeeded because he'd learned patience during his recovery. Learned to observe instead of act. Learned to listen instead of command. Back on Earth, Daniel's hometown of Portland erected a memorial. Just a simple statue of a thin boy sitting cross-legged with his hand extended. The inscription was short, Daniel Hayes, he taught dragons to be gentle and warriors to be wise. But around that statue something unexpected grew. His parents started a foundation using the money that poured in from across the globe. The Daniel Hayes Foundation didn't fund medical research or search for cures. Instead, it supported families with terminally ill children. It provided resources, counseling, and most importantly, it shared Daniel's story. It showed other sick kids that their lives had value. That weakness didn't mean worthless. That sometimes the people who struggle the most have the most important things to teach. His childhood friend, Kevin Walsh, became the foundation's director. Kevin had stuck by Daniel through the worst years, when other friends drifted away because they didn't know how to handle being around someone who was dying. Now he made it his life's work to ensure Daniel's message spread. Daniel used to tell me that being sick gave him a superpower, Kevin said in an interview that went viral across human space. Not like comic book powers, but the power to see what really mattered. When you know your time is limited, you stop wasting it on stupid stuff. You focus on what's real. On connections. On understanding. On leaving something behind that's bigger than yourself. The Varkesh military underwent a complete transformation. They established the Hayes Protocols, a new training system that taught soldiers to be more than just warriors. They learned conflict resolution, trauma counseling, cross-species communication. The goal was to create peacekeepers who could choose between violence and understanding, and would pick understanding first. Leading this transformation was a human volunteer named Thomas Grant. He'd been a Marine Corps sergeant before joining the Varkesh peacekeepers. He worked alongside Throck's daughter, a warrior named Krell who'd grown up believing strength meant crushing your enemies. Together, they proved that former adversaries could become partners when respect replaced domination. The Dragon Arena itself was transformed into the Daniel Hayes Interspecies Academy. The same Crimson Sands where champions had died for entertainment became classrooms where students from 100 species learned xenobiology, behavioral psychology, and conflict resolution. The 3 original WRMS served as teaching assistants, their extended lifespans maintained by Varkesh Medical Technology. Teachers would bring new students to meet memory, courage, and understanding. They'd tell them about the frail human boy who'd sat in this very spot and changed the course of galactic history. Some students didn't believe it at first. How could someone so weak accomplish so much? Then they'd watch the WRMS respond to proper handling techniques. See these massive predators become gentle under the right care. And they'd understand. Strength came in forms they'd never considered before. Daniel had proven that the weakest body could carry the strongest spirit. That compassion could conquer what violence never could. 10 years after Daniel's death, the galaxy looked completely different. Not because of wars or technological breakthroughs, but because of a shift in thinking that started with one sick teenager and 3 dragons in an arena. The Daniel Hayes Interspecies Academy graduated its 1000th class that spring. Students from over 100 species walked across the stage where warriors once died for entertainment. Among them was a young human woman named Rebecca Chen who'd been born without legs. She'd just been appointed as the galaxy's youngest diplomat, assigned to negotiate a peace treaty between 2 species that had been at war for 60 years. Daniel showed us that our limitations don't define us, she said in her graduation speech. They refine us. They teach us empathy. They force us to find creative solutions. I can't walk, but I can understand what it means to be underestimated. And that understanding? That's what makes me good at bringing enemies to the table. The 3 original WRMS, memory, courage, and understanding, were still alive, their lifespans extended by advances in Varkesh medical technology. They were old now, moving slower, but they still served as teaching assistants. Students would practice Daniel's techniques on them, learning the subtle hand signals and tonal patterns he'd discovered. But something strange kept happening. Late at night, when the academy was quiet, handlers would report hearing sounds in the arena. A low humming, rhythmic and mathematical, just like Daniel used to make. At first, they thought it was equipment malfunction or some kind of acoustic trick. But the WRMS would respond to it, lifting their heads and looking toward the center of the arena where Daniel had first sat down all those years ago. Scientists studied it extensively. There was no rational explanation. No source for the sound. But the WRMS heard it. And they remembered. Humanity had become the galaxy's go-to mediators. When conflicts erupted between species, both sides requested human negotiators. Not because humans were the strongest or the smartest, but because they had something special, an instinctive ability to find common ground, to see past surface differences, to empathize even with beings that looked nothing like them. Tyler Morrison exemplified this new generation of human diplomats. He'd lost both his legs and an arm in a shuttle accident at age 19. Doctors said he'd never work in space again. Instead, he became the lead negotiator for the Outer Rim territories, resolving disputes that had stumped career diplomats for decades. Daniel taught us that disability doesn't mean inability, Tyler explained during a conference on Earth. It means you approach problems differently. When you can't rely on physical strength or intimidation, you develop other tools. Patience. Observation. The ability to really listen instead of just waiting for your turn to talk. Back on Earth, the Daniel Hayes Foundation had grown into something remarkable. His parents, now in their 60s, had spent the last decade supporting thousands of families with terminally ill children. But they'd also done something else. They'd collected stories. Every family who'd been touched by Daniel's story was invited to share what it meant to them. Parents wrote about finding hope during their darkest moments. Sick children wrote about learning their lives had value even if they were short. Doctors and nurses wrote about changing how they treated terminal patients, focusing less on fighting death and more on making the time they had meaningful. Jennifer Hayes compiled these stories into a book called The Strength and Weakness. It became required reading in medical schools across Earth and eventually across the entire Varkesh Empire. One passage, written by a mother whose daughter had died from the same disease Daniel had, summed it up perfectly. My daughter lived 6 years. That's all. But she taught more people about love and courage in those 6 years than most people teach in 80. Daniel showed us that impact isn't measured in time. It's measured in change. In the ripples you create. My daughter created ripples. Daniel created waves. And those waves are still spreading. The Varkesh military was unrecognizable from what it had been. The Hayes protocols had produced an entire generation of warrior diplomats who understood that preventing conflict was harder and more valuable than winning it. They still trained for combat. Some situations required force. But now they trained equally hard in de-escalation, cultural understanding and trauma-informed care. Commander Lisa Park, a human who'd risen through the Varkesh peacekeeping ranks, commanded a fleet of 40 ships. Her crews were mixed species, former enemies working side by side. When asked how she managed such diversity without conflict, her answer was pure Daniel. I don't manage them. I understand them. Every being on my ships has a story, has struggles, has fears. When you take time to know those stories, you stop seeing crew members and start seeing people. That's what Daniel did with the W-arms. He saw past the monster to the scared animal underneath. I do the same with my crews. The Academy built a massive memorial at its center. A sculpture of a crimson WRM curled protectively around a small human figure. Beneath it, engraved in every written language in the known galaxy, were Daniel's final words. Strength comes in many forms. The mightiest fortress can be breached by armies, but a single act of kindness can conquer hate itself. I was the weakest human they could send, and perhaps that's why I could do what the strongest never could. I had nothing to prove through violence, so I proved something through peace. Remember, those who are broken can still build bridges. Those who are weak can still be wise. And sometimes, the frailest heart carries the greatest courage. Every graduate, regardless of species, recited these words at their commencement. Every Varkesh warrior carried them into service. Every human diplomat referenced them in negotiations. They'd become more than just words. They'd become a philosophy that reshaped how the galaxy thought about power. Robert Hayes visited the Academy for the 10th anniversary of Daniel's death. He was 70 now, his hair completely white, but he made the long journey from Earth to see what his son had built. War Chancellor Throck, now semi-retired but still influential, greeted him personally. Your son saved my empire, Throck said simply. Not from external threats. From itself. We were becoming monsters, defined only by our capacity for violence. Daniel showed us we could be more. Robert watched students working with WIRMS in the distance. A young Varkesh with a prosthetic arm was practicing Daniel's calming techniques. The WRM responded perfectly, gentle despite its size and power. He used to worry, you know, Robert said quietly, that his life didn't matter because it was going to be so short, that he'd be forgotten the moment he was gone. I wish he could see this. See that he mattered more in 17 years than most people matter in 70. That night, during the memorial ceremony, something extraordinary happened. Memory, the oldest of the 3 WRMS, approached the sculpture. It laid down beside the stone figure of Daniel, just like it had done in the real arena 10 years ago. Then it began to make sounds. Not growls or roars. A low, rhythmic humming that matched the pattern Daniel used to make. The crowd fell silent. Scientists scrambled to record it. But everyone there understood what they were witnessing. The WIRM remembered. After 10 years, through all the students it had worked with, all the handlers it had known, It still remembered the frail boy who'd shown it kindness when everyone else showed only fear. And in that moment, everyone understood why respect wasn't given. It was earned. Not through strength or conquest or dominance, but through connection, through understanding, through the courage to be vulnerable in a galaxy that valued only strength. They'd thrown a frail boy into the dragon arena expecting entertainment, expecting death, expecting confirmation of their superiority. Instead, he'd given them enlightenment. He'd changed not just minds but hearts. Not just laws but cultures. Not just an empire but an entire galaxy's understanding of what true strength really meant. Daniel Hayes had conquered the unconquerable. And the respect he earned would echo through the stars long after even memory, courage, and understanding had returned to dust.